Okay, we're going to get started once again. And one of the reasons why I am so delighted that Ann is here to talk about design, agency, and the pragmatic imagination is because we, within the world of universities, are in such desperate need of those tools. Because we're always talking about how to change universities. But it always strikes me, at least, that we do that with strategic plans as our principal instruments, which are based less on the anticipation of our desired future and more based on how we're going to thrive in a system that we might actually find deeply problematic, but nevertheless is the indicator of success. So Ann is one of the people who's not only written about this, but done the work that will help at least those of us in the room, those of us watching, and also those who are going to be learning more from her subsequent work about how to do it better. So thank you very much, Ann, for being here and continuing part two.
Part two, yes, yes. So, yeah, now I'm going to talk about where this has been applied and also what has affected the thinking around the other work. And that is designing or thinking about the future of the university as a design problem. This started, well, it started when I was recruited to OSU to be the director of the school. I was recruited with the mandate that I was supposed to help renovate architectural education. Politically, that was very difficult. But I began to actually design a first kind of model for change in a small way that could have a really big impact. It was a great 4 years. Politics were, well, the person who hired me and gave me the mandate left a month after I was hired, and therefore I got an engineering dean above me who used to call me into his office every 2 weeks and give me a lecture about, you're not supposed to have ideas, you're just supposed to manage. So after one term and after doing what I thought was significant benefit and raising $9 million, I decided that maybe there was something else I could do or another way I could do this. The president of Georgetown University, I had just met him and spent about 3 hours with him and his senior staff, and he said, could you come here, please? I don't know what we're going to do, but come here. So I came there and I sat in an office for about a month, and I said, I can't just sit here. So I went to a colleague of mine that I knew and said, let's do a design studio. He says, we don't have architecture. I said, no, I mean a humanities design studio. He says, what's that? And indeed, it had not yet. He says, it's a lab, right? I said, no, it's not. We're going to do a design studio. We're going to design. We're going to teach them to draw. So that was one of the things we did. We began to craft a new kind of entity. Did 2 design studios, taking on this as our project. And then I did one at OSU with architecture students and grad students. The ones at Georgetown were undergrads, all undergrads. None of them with design experience. Some had a little bit of drawing. The worst one in that group, his parents were architects, and he decided he knew all about this. And so he decided he wasn't going to listen too well and that he was going to teach me what architecture was. But anyways, the rest of them were, he was wonderful actually, but the rest, there was a brilliant group. Most of them already were multidisciplinary. They were already doing something like foreign service and Greek or whatever they were doing. So anyways, then I did one at OSU with architecture students, many of them grad students and design students, and it was wonderful to do it there again. Very different environment. One was an Ivy League-ish, and the other one was very much, big, large, 60,000 state school. I'm going to actually talk about this right now, even though I was going to talk about evocative objects later, just because it's up here. Setting oneself in motion, getting the imagination going. One of the things I tend to use a lot is the notion of evocative objects. Things that don't seem to mean anything directly related to what you're looking at, but onto which you map obsessions, images. They're like dynamic attractors for your imagination. You start to map things onto it. It's like a Rorschach ink blot test where you're asked, what did you see? It's the same thing. This has not yet been used successfully, but it's been in the back of everything we've done. This is a score by John Cage. When we've designed these models, we do a model, but we also look at the student pathway. In other words, how does it intersect with the kind of model or the ecosystem? And I just look at this and I go, that's what it should be. That's what a student's pathway should be through the system. And so little by little we've used different parts of this to, what is that? Why do I see that? Well, as reading onto it, I'm reading, what if this is, I don't know, this is disciplinary strings or something, and this is, or score, and maybe that's sciences, and maybe that's the humanities, or maybe it's something else. What if you did something and then you went out and you worked in the world and then you came back, and what if they got tangled up, and what if a chord or a series of things you did together, like a studio, wasn't a course? I don't know what it means yet, we don't know, but it is the idea of an evocative object, something you look at and you go, oh my God, there's something in there, and you begin to map onto it, use your imagination to try to read it for something other than which it wasn't intended. So I was just asked this wonderful question, I don't know where she went, about design. My Brazilian, well, I guess she might have left. She said she didn't understand because in her world, she's graphic design and I forget what the other design she does. She said she didn't understand how design intersected with that. And I said very specifically, this is coming out of architecture design more than the other design fields, because it's more than just about intersecting with the user. By nature, architecture, design has generally been deployed for designing things. So in education, it might be curricula, it might be classes, you might design new technologies, assessment protocols, budget models. So we can understand these things as content in the world. But beyond designing content, can we design contexts, which are the things around in which you work? And the reason, I had a slide, it went away, about why architecture. So the reason I came to this is because if you think about what architects do, yes, we make buildings, and buildings are made of stuff. But if I do a house for someone, I'm designing for the life of the people inside the house, and they give me some idea of what they're doing. When we were designing Carl Sagan, the astronomer's house, and his wife Annie, they said, we want 2 bedrooms and a kitchen that does this, and we want better systems and whatever. And I said, no, talk to me about you. Tell me your stories. Like, what do you mean by stories? Little by little, we got to know them and understood the tremendously passionate love they had for each other, and therefore we had to create separate studios where they could see each other whenever they wanted, but to get to each other, they had to go down 3 flights of stairs, over to the other side, up 3 flights of stairs, and back into the whatever, to get from studio to studio, because they wanted to see each other, but if they were together, they got nothing done. Things like that. The understanding the messiness of life. I'm now doing an amazing house for a family in the Poconos where the 12-year-old girl is going blind. The father's a doctor, and he's just beside himself why he can't help. The mother teaches, and she's always been very much, she likes to control her environment. So the family is breaking apart, not because they don't love each other tremendously. This project has become a way to pull that back together. So this idea of designing context. If I design a school, I think about the things happening in the school. If I design a school for 14 Southeast Asian countries where you have women from Islam, Hindu, Buddhist, Hindu, Buddhist, Muslim, and Christian, and they don't get along in this part of the world, I have to start thinking about, how do I understand identity? How do I design contexts that allow them to be together but not be together when they want? How do I design for women that are coming from a village where no one has ever left the village, and in 5 years they're supposed to be ready for the World Bank? And it needs to be secure because we have terrorists in the region, but if it doesn't look open, we're not projecting the right thing. What are the vehicles? So the understanding the different practices, the different kind of behaviors, the different rituals, the different meanings, and beginning to design a context for that, which began to, in that case, include not only the master plan, which we began to understand the landscape and water was everything, but it was about curriculum. It was about a different kind of program to go in 5 years from that one situation to another. It had to be a different kind of curriculum. So it was about designing a context that was a little bit more complicated. So going from even designing a context that's a house to a university, to a city, to a territory, it's one more level of abstraction to say, let me design the ecosystem, the relationships, curriculum to budget model to whatever, and maybe there aren't material, there's not stuff inside of it. So that's why architectural design more than, well, architecture, landscape, and urban has unique purchase, if you will, on thinking and designing things that shape contexts. And it also has unique tools to study it. That's not that the others aren't important disciplines, but it's already kind of primed. We've been doing it for 4 centuries. So this was a more ambitious talk than I expected, and so I'm going to give you a choice about halfway through about which projects we actually look at. But I want to talk about how we framed it first. This was very important, framing the design problem. There are kind of 2 camps that are working on innovation in education. There's a group that's really looking very seriously and rigorously at the problems in the system, the challenges, and the opportunities. There have been several brilliant, important government reports that have begun to lay that out. I've gone through all of them, and we've been able to create a taxonomy of what are considered the major strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, and danger signs in the system. There's a whole camp that's really working in this area, and they tend to, in the reductionist mode, break it apart and say, if we work on budget, that's the most important problem, so I'm going to work on budget. Let's work on budget and access, those are and they're really important problems, right? Whatever. But that's the one camp. The other camp is the one that says we have new disruptive technologies, let them do their job and let's see what we get in 15 years or so. This isn't good enough. Already MOOCs have proved that their promise isn't even close, what they can achieve isn't even close to promise, and I think there's dangers in the MOOCs. So we have all these new tools and mechanisms, and there's lots more we can invent. These are the 4 major platforms for different MOOCs. Amazing study done by the Institute for the Future, looking at new trends, so trying to forecast the future and say, let's pick the ones that are good outcomes and let's get rid of the bad outcomes through forecasting. But the thing we did was very, very different. The wrong slide's there, doesn't matter. So the way we approached it was to say, it's really important, all the problems. We have to honor the problems, but let's put them over here for now. These new disruptive technologies are really cool and exciting, and we could probably and they got lots of possibilities. They're fine, let's put them here. But as a designer, an architect, we always design for contexts. So we said instead, what is the context of 2033? What is 2033 as a context? If we were to design a university for 2033, what would that be? Not what is the incremental change we need, not so much how do we solve the problems. And what is interesting is that every single one of the models they came up with, which are sketches, they're not complete because these are students and it was only a semester, in every one of them, the budget and the access problem were solved. Just by the model, not because they went after solving them. So the idea that if you break apart a complex problem and solve one part of it, when that may not even be a problem in the problem, is a really interesting thing. So to design for that future context, we first have to, and then what you do, if you can actually design for 2033, you can then look at where we are now, and then what is the system of actions you need to create to close the gap from here to there. Not incrementally, how do we solve things and as the system is changing. And the reason why this ended up being so important is I had no clue, but I do now, how different now is 2033 than the legacy university was designed for. So the first thing is to make this major paradigm shift, and all of the studio was scaffolded with intellectual, and I'll just show you how the studio worked as well. So we first have to understand, to make a major paradigm shift, you have to understand how what you have is got there. So this is a beautiful piece by Clark Kerr, who where he talks about, and this was a sketch done by my colleague, the notion that the first universities were imported models from Oxford and England, which was about liberal education. It was about educating people, the whole person, with critical thinking and all of the different disciplines you need to either be, in the United States, a lawyer, a doctor, or a clergy, right? So those were the kind of first 3 professions, the idea of the whole person, the imported model for that. Then after World War I, the idea that the United States to begin to become, it was a growing, we were a growing country, it was really, very important to become a leader in the world, and therefore research should be important. We should actually not just be teaching people, not just focusing on the student, we should begin to focus on knowledge construction. So they imported the German research model, and they began to bring that into the system pretty much whole hog. Then there was the moment at which the land-grant, I'm oversimplifying, of course, the land-grant university, there was the idea that there are some universities where the community has needs, and it's not about just educating our students and research at a certain level. The community has very real needs, and this was the beginning of the land-grant. And with the land-grant, and with the interest in the community came all the other things that made the university a community, sports, and clubs and all of the other components of it. So in a sense, our universities, the best, the brightest, and the not best and brightest, are in some fashion the result of three responses to the context around them. But they didn't transform, they stayed pretty much intact. This is undergraduate education, this is graduate education, and this is the major university, the community-based. And that's really how they've stayed in the system till today. It's the legacy of the multiversity that Kerr talks about. The interesting thing is that these several competing visions, they were competing visions of true purpose, each relates to a different layer of history, a different web of forces, a different context, and it causes much of the malaise in the university communities today as they compete for funding. Do we charge graduate fees and then support our undergraduates with tuition? Do we, all of the things that are going on, these competing conditions. It's so many things to so many different people. At the same time, the actual mechanisms, not the model, but the mechanisms that drive the university are influenced by the Industrial Revolution. The idea that we need to take the farmer from the field and get him into the factory. Take the farmer who knows how to work holistically, may start with one problem, he's out to save a calf, but the fence needs fixing, so that gets done instead. Someone who understands a holistic thing, who does not operate by a bell, how do you begin to get them primed for the factory of the Industrial Revolution? How do you get them into a worker mentality? It's with 45-minute classes. Sorry, you love math? We're done with math. And you go on to the next thing. I don't know if you know where grades came from, but the group that was putting together the major K-12 act, I've forgotten the name because I'm not a scholar of this, one of the people in the group was a meatpacking, whatever, CEO. And he said, well, in meat, we do grade A, grade B, grade C. And they said, that's good enough. And this is not, I'm making light of it, but that is the way it came about. So that the idea that the Industrial Revolution, or that you would get, how do you get the shop owner, the more urban side of the farmer, into the office? How do you begin to create a system whereby you can now create an engineered, automated production system? This was all coming on the heels of all of the way industry was changing, the Ford and industry, that. So this is the issue. We have that legacy. We have people, we have a whole group of amazingly brilliant, articulate, earnest people that are working on the problems aspect of it, because clearly this is not well suited today. Then we have a whole bunch of people going, this is cool, open access, we got technologies, MOOCs, we can do, now we can do AI and we can figure out what everybody's thinking. These are important, but the real question is really, what are we aiming at? What is the context we're designing for? Not how do we bandage and strategically and incrementally change something that's different. So I've already gone through, so it's about looking at the issue another way, reframing the brief, the university of the 21st century, the idea that to really make a paradigm shift, you have to understand how the world you live in today was constructed and how it is like and unlike the world you live in now. So that these two parts of it. I've already talked about the whole notion of TIMN. These are the things. So the first thing we do in the studio is we begin to look at so that's Ronfeld there, we begin to, there's a whole series of intellectual scaffolding, of readings about what's going on. Oh, and the reason we picked 2033 is really interesting. Most of my students are 20 years old. We started in 2013. You know, for them, 2033 is like everything that they've already lived. It's so far out that for them it's sci-fi. For those of us that are a little older than 20 years old, 20 years is like coming tomorrow. But so we look at a whole bunch of really brilliant people. I don't know if you know Yoki Benkler's work on the wealth of networks. Again, this is design. It's not about creating a thesis. It's not about getting the right answer. It's not about knowing everything about networks. It's about getting enough really good core samplings of what people are talking about intellectually who are doing really good work in helping us understand what today is and why it's changing. So we look at Yoki Benkler and how he talks about a big difference is the densification and global scope of interconnectivity. And because of this interconnectivity, we have new ways of doing everything that our educational system has no ability to prepare us for. Things like monitory democracy or participatory governance, Arab Spring, Occupy Wall Street, citizen movements, the X Prize, citizen science, Wikipedia, apps, fan clubs, content creation, interest groups, games, online games, transmedia, backstories, the ability to do things differently, whole new disciplines. When I do world building, I'm working with the person who actually did the world building for Minority Report. It was supposed to be the future. Steven Spielberg didn't see Facebook coming. He didn't see social media coming. You know, the notion that we have all these new things that are coming on them. And because of this, we can do things differently in education. Because of this interconnectivity, we're engaged in a whole new set of conflicts without clear resolution or end state. A lot of the students were actually working with this. This is the World Economic Forum's risk landscape. They do this every year to determine what things should be at Davos in their discussions. And they map the likelihood of something happening versus the impact should it happen. The colors are for different domains. We have governance, we have environmental, we have financial. And they begin to map something like, here's unintended consequences of new life science technologies, where likelihood is low and kind of impact might be low, all the way up to terrorism, where likelihood is great, impact is great, water supply is at the very top. These are interesting. They do this every year. What's most interesting is that they then do another one which says, here are the 10 topics. And from year to year, the color changes, meaning one year it might all be environmental. Next year it might be mostly government. So it becomes really very interesting. And then they tend to focus on those, and they begin to create these risk maps. We talk about complex problems. This is interesting. She used to be head of one of the cyber divisions. The fact that she's recognizing that problems are no longer just social is a big deal. Are no longer just technical is a big deal. We talk about acceleration, instability, disturbance, the resilience gap. We read about that. We talk about big data and the data-driven society. What are the implications for all of that, all the way to the vulnerability of privacy? We talk and read about new technologies and issues of access. We talk about population growth. We talk about demographics. And even just probably the most interesting is we talk about identity shifts. Since education, especially undergraduate, is really about is helping the formation of a person, we talk about a lot about identity shifts and how concentric circles of identity, me, my family, my community, my country, whatever, are now overlapping multiple identities. I may be part of the place that I work, but I might be part of an online community in gardening. I don't garden. I might be part of whatever, and I have all these different both cyber identities and real life identities. The most important thing is that we come from a perspective that there are three ways to look at the future. You can either say, and all of this work is part of that, you can say, gee, I don't know what the future is going to be, so let me just sit here and wait till it happens. You can say, let's forecast. Let's put the trends out there. Let's figure out what could happen and mitigate for it. Or you could understand that we are building our futures with every decision we make, no matter how little or large they are. Shouldn't be a scary proposition, but it's this notion that it's all the little kind of fractalized decisions that we make are changing the future. All the small decisions we all make along the way. And we talk about a new concept of globalization. Okay. So that's the kind of intellectual scaffolding to say, let's try to understand as much as we can in about a month what is this context that we're designing for. Remember, this is provisional work. We're not building this tomorrow. We're trying to get at some stuff. And it's amazing how they really ate this up, if I can use that really blunt terminology, and we're beginning to find insights and connections between things that were absolutely amazing and very prescient. So did 2 at Georgetown and 1 at OSU. We've just done a 3rd one at Georgetown differently. 2 things. We were reinventing. It was, first of all, the project was interesting in and of itself, but I want to talk about the fact that we really were creating a whole new course, which is this idea of a humanities studio, to advance this conversation. So a humanities studio that was based upon architectural design studios. And these are kind of the 8 critical things that were brought from architecture. We looked at precedents, which I'll talk about in a minute. This idea of intellectual scaffolding, not writing a paper or doing a thesis. Scaffolding design work with really good, rigorous, as responsible in the time that we had as possible thinking. Visual skill building, world building. I'll talk about those 4 briefly. This is critical. In a design studio, you have permission, and this the Georgetown students couldn't get. They're just like, what? It doesn't have to be right. Permission to not know what you're doing. This is really critical. They have permission to, you have to move ahead. In moving ahead, you create action that then you can reflect on, and it's the reflection on that creates the judgment, the critical practice that then moves back into action. Once they got it, they just loved it, and I've unfortunately polluted them for life. And their other professors are wondering what's going on. But anyways, this notion of provisionality is another one, that you're not making decisions, you are making provisional assumptions that, again, you act on, reflect on, critique, listen to the pushback in the system, and then it begins to move into another provisional until all of the intersection with the kind of system, the thinking around it, says that it's kind of a good assumption. The role of evocative objects, I've already talked about. And here's another one, this notion that we weren't after completeness at all. You can't do a university in whatever, but coherence. Coherent systems following a motivated thing they wanted to accomplish for the context of the 21st century. So precedence, which my friend John Seeley Brown just goes crazy over, he loves this idea. It's something we do naturally in architecture. We look at other things, not to copy them, not to analyze them to death, but to understand how someone else is doing something, did something to get ourselves started. So no one's done this in education before, but these are just some of them. We took precedents that were specifically educational systems, ecosystems, in which an ideology, meaning something they were trying to accomplish, had translated into an entire learning and research ecosystem. So the fact that there was something they were trying to accomplish, not just educate students. And so Tagore is in here, the Shaolin monks, these have the Shakers, these are ideologies associated with them. And the systems they constructed, the Shakers, for instance, is a 24-hour-a-day, all your life system. It doesn't have school and not school, right? So we looked at them. Here's a bunch we took. So Arizona State University, the Catholic University of Valparaiso, its Institute of Architecture, which very much designed consciously a new system. Google, Minerva, MIT Media Lab, Shakers, and Minerva is a brand new university based upon a digital platform. The Shaolin monks, and then Tagore's Indian Progressive University. We analyze them and we unpack them using a framework where we look at what is the epistemological, how do they begin to, what's the model and the mechanisms for learning and teaching? The psychosocial, what is it about the psychosocial that's part of the learning system, and what is it about it that's actually helping to construct the individual and the civic dimension. So that's a framework through which to analyze a precedence. I've talked about intellectual scaffolding. We had two different lists. Visual skill building is another thing. I had to give them, we spent intense time talking about information visualization and getting them to draw. And I'll show you why. You'll see what the diagrams are. Very, very crude, but getting them to draw, getting them to get their ideas down into diagrams through using principles of visualization. We specifically look at Tufte and Lima. Tufte, if you know his work in visioning information, he took about four centuries worth of visual documents and began, some of them are brilliant, and began to actually break them apart and said, here are the kind of 5 principles for visualizing information. The first thing we talk about, though, is how is big data different than infographics, different than visualization. The key to that is information visualization is about how do you ask questions and aggregate different kinds of information sets and make them coherent visually. Then we look at Manuel Lima, which is the second wave of information visualization happening once big data hit and we could make interactive visualizations. The principles are the same as Tufte's, but the capacities were different. And world building, which is one of the tools in the book, which is a really important one. World building is a methodology we take from cinema. This is from Minority Report. I've worked with Alex McDowell. Alex was the production designer that helped world build Minority Report with Steven Spielberg. It's a methodology for constructing, designing worlds you would want to inhabit with all of the texture of a real world. It was a major paradigm shift, has been a major paradigm shift. Actually started with literature before that. Think Lord of the Rings, think even Jonathan Swift. The notion that the story is not as important as the world in which it sits. The idea that even though the story may only occupy 10% of the world, when John Anderton goes left, they know what was happening on the right. So it's a whole way. It's a methodology that is really about envisioning a whole new university with texture and detail and working off of that. I've already talked about evocative objects. The main thing we were doing is what's called speculative design, in which we tend to, the actual limits of what is achievable normally depend in part on the beliefs people hold about what sorts of alternatives are viable. This is the issue. When you're world building, when you're speculating on a future, trying to create something you desire, not something you deserve, not simply a default, it's speculative design where you're trying to make a whole range of possibilities viable for consideration. Things that seem like science fiction in Minority Report, little spider robots, right? The minute you can see it, the minute you can imagine it, the minute you can see it bump up against the architecture, and what are the repercussions when the little, I don't know, I'm probably assuming you all have seen Minority Report, the little robots go down through all of the tubes and all of that. The minute you understand the implications of a drug abuse of Anderton and the way he sees the world, you're allowing the ability to occupy a world and test it out. Someone asked about simulations before. It's another way of simulating a world and trying to test out the ramifications of it. So we were engaging in that, beginning to make viable and seeable a whole set of alternatives that you wouldn't get to any other way. We're world building. I'm world building now with Party Rand Graduate School. They've come up with a future, a design for themselves that they never would have gotten to. We worked with 140 people. It's a beautiful new educational model with 3 streams to it. I worked with the Association of Research Libraries, which are all the research libraries in the US, 160 of them. They've come up with a future that they never could have imagined and a system of action that they're now working on to fill it in. It's really, and we worked with 400 people there. And all of them have said that they see their voice in every one of the projects. Okay, so what did we do? Really, what did we do? The key is that what you'll be looking at is we began to diagram models. The idea is that this was not about master plans and buildings. It was about learning and research ecosystems. How do you draw a learning and research ecosystem, so you can think about it. Well, we went back to other kinds of drawings that are similar. This is an 18th century cosmic diagram in the Indian collection of the Brooklyn Museum. This is a drawing that maps the cosmos as it was conceived by the ancient Indian religion of Jainism. So it's a way of looking at, it has to do with ideas of rivers and different houses and different senses of power against other things. Very large scale, detailed elements of it as well. So it's about looking at a map that tries to show relationships. So what you will be looking at, and here's an architectural analogy. In architecture, the very first thing we do is we come up with a schematic set of drawings. This is a house that was done by Le Corbusier. It was an idea about putting a wall around the site, the view across, how he framed the view. So this is a sketch. This is an idea. This is a concept. This is an ideogram. An architect will do this. Then they will create a series of measured drawings that are now trying to create a more precise design of the real relationship, sizes of rooms, structure, materiality, etc. From these drawings, they will build it. That's the architectural analogy. This is what you'll be looking at. This is all they've done. This is what the students are doing. They are not complete, but they're really coherent. And each of them was after a mission. The first thing they had to do was to say, this is what I think should be the mission for the 21st century. Okay? And they're crude as well. So here's just a, oops. I may not be able to play this. Yeah, so this is us in studio the first year. These kids had never drawn before. This is my co-teacher. This is the fourth week we had them drawing. Okay. So in addition to the kind of main map of their ecosystem, and I don't want to get your hopes up too much, they're not quite like that. And they created PowerPoints to explain these things. We also tried to look at the student pathway. How does the student intersect with the system? Okay. Oops. So. Okay, so to just show you what we came up with. So there were a series of 7 or 8 projects over the first 2 years. And what I did to try to understand them, because we're going to publish this summer, the idea is also we're trying to convene a design week of university presidents to get them doing this as well. Jack DeJoy has agreed to do that. The first thing to do was to map what we already received, the work that they'd already done, because I wanted to know how it fell out. So there are 2 maps. One is that there were actually students who were really taking on the idea of a new model, as if tomorrow you were given $500 million to do this. They didn't articulate it that way, but that's how they were approaching it. And the black ones are their projects. So I wanted to map this from those things that were more comfortable, that looked more like what we already have today, to the things that were more radically innovative. So that's the horizontal. The vertical is kind of degree of I don't want to say achievement, but really reflecting the level of engagement with the kind of 21st century context. So at the very least, to deeply understand the context, to both now and as it is evolving. So that's the least thing to achieve. The second would be the ability to operate effectively in this context. So it means that you can navigate the white water up to a certain level of rapids, and you get how it works. Third is to have agency in. Fourth, play a leadership role. The fifth is a really weird thing. We said ontologically to be of the 21st century, a state of being that resonates, where it now is tacitly, you just operate like this person. So all of the projects had titles. This one, called Complex Problems and Radical Empathy, is a new university, but it really looks quite a bit like what we have now. So if you show it to a university president, they're like, "Ah, we can't do that." Community of Practice U, which is really interesting. We're actually using this as a starting point for one of the streams at Rand. And then Hacker U, which is at the very top, which was after resilience and really creating a kind of, and hackers have a real community around them. There's a negative connotation to it, but we were using a very specific paper about hacker culture. What I was surprised with is after I did this, I said, well, there aren't really that many that are truly to the radically innovative. And then I said, let's map some of the precedents to see how they would map. Minerva being new, maps here. ASU is rather radical. He's had problems, but it's still, it's not, you know. MIT Media Lab we felt was there, and everybody thinks MIT Media Lab's super radical, but that's really where we mapped it. And actually, then I was like, then the only one that really was the Shaolin monks was the one that I could put up there. And then the interesting thing is I said if Minerva wanted to get more radical, it would be an easy transformation for them to actually become a community of practice. They've got the platform. They're all set up for it. They don't quite have their mission, but that could be it. The MIT Media Lab could actually become something much more resilient if it were listing towards that model. Then the other map were projects that never really embraced full university, but instead were creating new mechanisms, new things that would begin to transform the existing university. So in a sense, they're the easiest to pull off, and we've already started some of these. And so this one maps from, again, the vertical is the same, but here are maps from things that are put into the system to projects that were always working at the level of the system. They weren't just saying, for instance, things that put into the system. One is this project for how you could create a first year that is so radical, it would transform the rest of the university because the pull, the change in the students would be that much. So here's how so we have one called Cura Personalis Updated. Don't ask me what that is. It would take too long. Hero's Journey. So this was one which is about a first year, a major first year that would be so incredibly different. This was one called Axolotl, based upon a funny little creature that doesn't know what it is. And when it's on the ground, when it's outside the water, it's amphibious. When it's in the water, it's literally a fish. But the ability to transform yourself with agility. One of the most interesting one is the one at the top, which really was things, but it's things put in at 4 scales so that ultimately it was the most virally systemic. Omnis, which is a brilliant one, which took seriously the social structure that has emerged, the social system that has emerged from World of Warcraft, and took that structure and said, if we don't focus on learning only as teaching, and we understand that the best learning and assimilation is in study groups, can we begin to transform the university by looking at the social structure and not the other? Why World of Warcraft is so impressive is because it is completely emergent. It's the players over 12, 15 years, they have created a social structure of learning that is beyond impressive, and it works at many different levels depending upon degree of task. That's one that's being mapped into a lot of projects, and dynamic attractors is one that is beyond brilliant because it really is a transformational construct for universities that amplifies their uniqueness, and in doing that gets rid of the whole budget problem and opens the university up to the future. So we don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to let you pick. These are the 5 that I have here that I was going to show you, and depending upon your interest in radicality or what could we do tomorrow, I have complex problems and radical empathy, which is this one right here. Very much a wonderful transformation of kind of what we have now. Very thoughtful. I'm lobbying for I have Homo Ludens, this one here, which is kind of bizarre, but absolutely wonderful. Most people go, huh? But I love it. So I have dynamic attractors and Hacker U and the community of practice U. So what would you Okay, pick one. I think we can do two. No, so it's not just. I mean, I would stay till 6, but if that's what it would. But
Radical empathy.
okay, good. We'll do that one. So we'll do dynamic attractors and radical empathy, which are 1 and 2. That makes my life so easy in order. So the projects, the first 4 and all the others, there really were a series of core concepts that ran across all of them. I just want to show them to you because this is what the students are thinking about, right? Resilience. Students should be, education should be about resilience. It should be about agility, agency, global citizenry, complex problems across the board. And it's not just that I seeded the water. These were their kind of interests. Some of the thought experiments was the idea of turning the university inside out, learning through research. Drivers, all of it was about inquiry. Can we learn through inquiry? Problem-based learning and global sites. There were other things, but these were the ones that were generic. Desires, all of the students. Again, this is Georgetown. This was not OSU. All about learning through doing, wanting to participate in the world. And Georgetown, as you know, is a Jesuit university. And even if one isn't Catholic or Jesuit, it is about your role in the world. And it's all about radical empathy. The fears they had, preparing better for the real world, the pace of change, and how to make sense of the world. Okay, so complex problems and radical empathy, number 1. So each of these were presented as a PowerPoint in which they built their story but came to an ultimate 2 sets of drawings. So they said their primary goals was to create students who could work on complex problems with radical empathy. And what is a complex problem? They said, here's an example, climate change, superstorm Sandy, Kiribati, and the Indian power outage. Yeah, I know. Driving forces, these are their slides, by the way. A broken business model, personalization they were interested in. They took they instead of redefining complex problems, they said, let's just take the World Economic Forum's model. Let's start working with that. Let's just accept the way they look at it. And so they mapped that in here. These are the 5 different color domains. So there are economic ones, there are environmental ones, societal, geopolitical, and technological. So they took the color structure, they took the kind of definition of complex problems. So there was, first of all, each of these have about 5 core concepts. In theirs, there was an idea of a global campus. There was actually an idea, this is out of order, but there was an idea that there were 3 sites for the university. A global campus, the campus, the university campus, which happened to be Georgetown. So that's the idea of campus is important, and a digital campus, a digital site, which is the virtual campus. The global campus is made up of many sites that would be affiliated with Georgetown. They built a lot of these through scenarios. They pulled out 4 different people at these different sites and a connection between them. The idea that you would join other students from around the world, ubiquitous computing would tie it together. Okay, these are less, okay, so there's the concept of the 3 different sites, the campus community, the online platform, and the global sites. The idea would be that the campus community is about liberal arts specialization, the online, liberal arts, which is a holistic education and specialization, an online platform in which you would begin to get all of your GE, the math, the computer science, and they said these are the things you need to get. Everybody needs to get math, computer science, econ, logic, personal finance, science, engineering, writing and grammar, and languages. That the sites that you would work at would begin to transfer to you empathy, teamwork, mentorship, reflection, maturity, and problem solving. So that was how each of these different sites were used. That's core concept 1, 3 sites for learning in different and diverse concepts. Core concept number 2 was the idea of a first-year discovery program. So the idea is that they would have these global sites. They identified one here. There was Venice there. Not sure what cities they were looking at here specifically. And that each of these would be project sites that would be ongoing sites in which these different, the blues, the reds, these different domains were implicated in it. That a student when they joined Georgetown, when they joined this university, the very first thing they would do is go to an offsite. They would go to that offsite with a declared desire. So they have this woman who's a celloist and an engineer who changes her focus as she goes. You would pick an offsite, you would go to one of those offsites, you would begin to join a team, and the goal was that after a year, you would both learn more about yourself, and you would learn about the site and how to work in an embedded manner, and specifically begin to pick up some kind of empathy, which I'm passing over lightly because it suggests that just by being somewhere you gain empathy, which you don't. But how do you scaffold that with philosophy? How do you scaffold that with other courses? How do you really actually build that? So here's the idea of a project site. It's got little, this is about Venetian origins. A project is going on, Venetian origins DNA study. These are 4 examples. Then there's another project about canal flooding prevention project, and it's got these different domains in it. There's another project in Venice, art preservation, lagoon ecosystem analysis, Venetian cargo delivery system. So different projects going on in Venice, all the time, sustained. So the first year students, I don't quite remember what this is about, but this is the idea that the first year students have one degree of kind of surface embeddedness. You then have older students, these are third year students, faculties, and local institutions are involved, and then there's the city of Venice itself. Over the year, so they still assumed that there was going to be 4 years, 2 semesters. That was their assumption. They didn't have to assume that. So this is why it's very close to now. And that in the first month, it's intro to culture, 3 months of hands-on involvement, 1 where you transition to the next group, and 1 it's about reflection and identifying your entry now into the university, identifying the community of practice that you're going to enter into. Oops. Sorry, it crashed. Okay. So this is about a first-year discovery program supported by virtual site online platform. So while you are doing that first year, you are taking basically your GE or your general electives, content that you can get in a kind of social study group, but don't necessarily need a professor for. That is supplementing the kind of discovery that's happening while you're there. So you're getting a series of foundational modules. This is from their larger drawing. The third concept is that on campus, instead of having disciplines, you have communities of practice. A community of practice, if you haven't heard the term, is a group of people who work together at different levels from beginner to expertise, and they have a shared set of practices, there's a culture, tools. It's much bigger than a discipline. When I'm in a community of practice of architects, it means that we're all working together on the same thing. It's not about you teaching me. So each of my studios, architecture studios where I'm teaching students of 15 people, I say to them, we're a community of practice working on the same problem but 14 different perspectives. Therefore, we're all helping each other. The beginners learn from the experts learn from the beginners as well. This is very different than about disciplines. It already, even though it's different as a practice, it just is completely emotionally, psychologically, mentally, structurally different because you're working on it together. So this is a really big thing. So the system overview, they began to say, this is the system, and therefore instead of disciplines, we have a kind of business community of practice. You could then understand other communities of practice in that. We have languages. These are the ones they pulled out. Arts, government, STEM, with other compartments in it, the social sciences and the humanities. They saw those as the kind of parent, if you will, communities of practice. And then these represent the sites that we just looked at, the outside sites. Core concept 4 is this issue of balancing real-world projects with projects and research inside the university. This was a brilliant moment when they began to say, because so many of the students I talked to, they all want project-based learning, but it's all about real-world projects. Forgetting that, first of all, faculty are often working on what is either called basic research or esoteric research, or why would anybody do that research? You know, the notion of things that might be deeply theoretical, but string theory, which seems to be purposeless when you do it, but ends up being incredibly important science down the line. So the idea that in addition to these, there is research going on deep within the university that may not yet have a relationship to the outside world. Some of that research may be simply one community of practice doing it. Some of them might already be overlapping community of practices. So the idea that you balance that with that. And then this fifth concept, which was really interesting, is they talked about the idea that all of these community of practices get tied together with what they called epistemological threads. Threads of kind of learning, constructing learning. And they said that these epistemological threads, do I have, yeah, I have them here. So one of them, the middle one, is communication. Then the next one, so then there's the kind of humanities, liberal arts side and of these epistemological threads, and then there's the science side. So this is philosophy, this is humanities, this is complex systems, and that's science, technology, and engineering. So the idea that lacing through all of this, everybody is doing something around humanities, philosophy, communication, complex systems, and STE. The reason it was done this way is communication is considered the kind of bridge between bringing these different kind of vernaculars together. The really interesting thing they then mapped is they said each community of practice, the thread would be a different dimension, implying a different value or different level of engagement of the humanities, or philosophy, or communication, or complex systems. So you can see complex systems gets thick within the engineering and in their mind. So again, these are representative, they're not the reality. So that was really interesting. Then they looked even at the slow and fast variables idea, and they said that science, technology, and engineering works mostly in the fast, and humanities can slow. I mean, this is not perfect. I don't even quite understand how they got to this, but it's really interesting as a framework. It's an interesting way to think about it. Because if you see this as a sketch, and if one begins to adapt or take parts of this, then what happens is you begin to think more clearly, both about how it intersects with your own and also how it might be used. So that's the whole system overview. And then this is one of the students' pathways. I never knew what that was. I still don't. But no, really. I mean, but you know, they did it and they knew what it was, and that was really important. So the idea that a student, you know, might work within these communities of practice. I mean, I do know a little bit. I think the circles represent courses, and the line is you're moving through courses, but it doesn't map with Janika, who is their student that they took through the system. So she was an engineer from Denmark. She went to Venice because she's an engineer, and she wanted to go to Venice. She then comes in, and she studied, what happened is she went to Venice, went in, she wanted to be a materials engineer, came back out saying, I want to do water. I want to be a water engineer instead. So it was in that first year of working that she tried out a lot of different things, got to know herself. You know, I'm so tired of hearing about let passions dictate what you do when most people don't know what their passions are, not because they don't have them, but because of lack of exposure. There's just no exposure. I wasn't exposed to architecture ever in my life. I found it somewhere around 22 or something. So anyways, Janika then comes in and she works in the community of practice. She takes courses is along these different epistemological threads. Some of it's project work. Then she decides, oh, I really need to get some expertise in water dynamics, fluid dynamics or something. She then comes in and she works on a project, a research project that's very theoretical, where they're really looking at intense new modeling, let's say, around water dynamics. So she does that. She goes, now I'm going to do another project which is actually much more multidisciplinary. It's an evacuation project around people who've been displaced because of water problems. Well, it's just great, right? And then she moves back out to Malaysia and does another project out there. And the idea being that, and she takes some more virtual courses. So the idea being that a student begins to create their own pathway through the system, but the first year being a critical component to that. Than the foundation models. So anyways, you can see we were trying to approximate John Cage, but we didn't get there. So but it was a good attempt to, and the thing is, the evocative objects are useful because they weren't even thinking epistemological threads until they looked at the John Cage, and that came out of it. Okay, and then there was an issue of the curriculum is not a roadmap. Here, take 5 of these and 4 of these and take them in this amount of time and take this one first, take this one second. But that instead, as you're building your own pathway, and several of the students actually dealt with how do you build a pathway, you begin to pick up badges of a certain source. Again, I'm not quite sure what they were doing, but it was cool. This I understand more. So in the end, this is her transcript, and it's about these courses in these areas, these projects, engineering core, what's been done digitally, what's been done elsewhere, the project she's worked on. This was an evocative object that was so important to them. They were stuck on university only as project-based learning, and therefore where you really, and the minute they saw this one, we use these beautiful Aboriginal drawings that I have, the minute they saw the hands reaching out and the hands reaching in, they got unstuck. And these lines also. So the evocative object, they didn't copy this. They used this because they were stuck. And they found a way to get unstuck, which is what we do often. So the core concepts, just to repeat, 3 sites, learning in contexts, different contexts. Cyber context for things that you can get just as content. The on-campus context to participate in communities of practice where beginners and experts work together. And then the off-site context, right, which is about really being embedded. Interspace, the first-year discovery program, communities of practice replace disciplines, inquiry-driven. You balance projects outside with research inside the university, and it's tied together through epistemological threads. What was the second one? Oh, we wanted dynamic attractors. Okay, sorry. That's the third one. Okay, this one's fantastic. This is just, we've actually presented this to the White House. They're very interested. From boiling pot to dynamic attractors, shaping the pathway forward. This was a really interesting premise. This is a drawing they did which reminded me of Le Petit Prince. I don't know if it reminds any of you, but it was beautiful. The premise was simply this. The world is changing. Universities are changing. What's happening as they change is the boundaries are breaking away. We no longer need to have the physical boundary of campus because we can learn in cyberspace, especially if you're talking about access. At the same time, disciplinary boundaries are breaking down because people want to do other kinds of work, but also because many disciplines are fracturing into multiple disciplines that are now blending with other disciplines. So if the university today has remained coherent because boundaries keep it together, the walls of the campus keep everybody in, the boundaries of the disciplines begin to be the way we create epistemological containers. If these are breaking down, instead of a boiling pot that's holding everything together, so boundaries are breaking apart. How do you now keep the university together? How do you create a community that's a community of practice around learning that has coherence and is whatever? There's the idea of dynamic attractors, which if you, I'm going to go through these. And then I'll back up. So it's the idea of instead of a boiling pot holding all of this energy together, dynamic attractors are centers of gravity to which things, around which things orbit, things come towards. Okay. So here's the interesting thing. The first thing in this project is to begin to look at your, why it's also really interesting is that every university has a set of values. Their values over time have led them to make decisions to invest in certain things and not in other things, to attract certain people and not other people. And in doing that, they have created a series of reasons people come to the university. Those could be people, they could be programs, they could be sports, they could be Washington, D.C. There are a whole series of reasons people come to Georgetown. So the first thing you need to do is you need to map your dynamic attractors. They are instantiations, manifestations of values. So you figure out what those are, and the way they began to map it was around, let me get to a better map. Okay, here's the map that we began to develop. So if you take the idea of the spectrum, which are disciplines, that's what this talks about. So they're taking a little bit from the previous group. If complex problems are the thing at the middle, deep research, general courses, and digital content, the idea that you can map any university's propensity. So here they're mapping MIT. MIT, most of its dynamic attractors will fall in that zone. So it shows how every university is different. Did I miss Georgetown? Yeah, I missed Georgetown. Okay. This is then overlapping MIT and Georgetown. So then they said most of Georgetown's dynamic attractors fall in that zone, mostly business, medical, law, government, social science, than the smaller ones. So here's the notion that this is where your dynamic attractors lie. Then they began to actually create a construct to understand each dynamic attractor. So a framework that said so Arab studies, you can map, it has a little bit of focus on influence, a lot of focus on expanding. Oh, I'm sorry, this is focusing influence, that's expanding influence. Knowledge dissemination, knowledge creation, experimental learning, codified learning. The point is that you can take every one of those things that people come to Georgetown for, Arab studies, and begin to look at its characteristics. Is it more theoretical or practice? Is it more about disseminating stuff or more about constructing new knowledge? So they went and they said, here are bioethics, the core. So the core is a club, if you will. Madeleine Albright, a person. CSI, an institute. Washington, D.C., a place. Berkeley Center, another, this is their social entrepreneurship center. The basketball team, Kevin O'Brien, Father Kevin O'Brien. Arab studies, so anyways, you can see things, people, institutes, courses, whatever, anything that people come from, they were able to map all these. Then the idea that you could actually situate those dynamic attractors in the overall map. Again, we're just mapping what they've got. There's MIT. There's those there. There's Georgetown again. And some outside players. Then it becomes interesting. You map the dynamic attractors and what can you do with it? Well, first of all, maybe you offload some courses. Does every university need to teach Psych 101? Probably not. So Georgetown certainly doesn't need to teach Psych 101, but they need their students to have it, so they say digitally. So the idea that you would pass the courseware through the membrane and then begin to replace it with digital content that could be learned that way. Also, at the same time, your own dynamic attractors are things you're going to want to make digital content around, you're going to want to share with the world. For instance, if Psych 101 is one of your dynamic attractors, you're going to make digital content. Georgetown then is going to say, here are 6 different Psych 101s you guys can take as a series of granular components, and here are the different perspectives, approaches, biases of each of them. Really, really wonderful. But you're going to want to take content from your dynamic attractors, and you're going to want to make content that then you can use to help bring money and people and all that stuff into the university. These little things are courses that are not themselves dynamic attractors, but every one of these needs some support. And so the support has got to be kept. So if Psych 101 or Arab language is important, you keep it. The beautiful thing is that now you can begin to architect. In addition to offloading and creating content, you can begin to architect things that happen. You can begin to say, we want to create a greater connection to Madeleine Albright. So we're going to create a kind of, she's going to make a course or come in and teach within this attractor, and it's going to create a relationship. Actually, it wasn't about her because she's one of the dynamic attractors. Another thing you might do is you might say, well, you know what, we actually need new disciplines, which we do. So they're really good at bioethics. Can we model a new institute called data ethics on bioethics? Not just, okay, let's talk about the ethics of data. Bioethics is 5 disciplines that work together, And if you could, then would you put it in here, and all of a sudden the Berkeley Center would become interested, Madeleine Albright would be part of that, and bioethics might be part of that. So now you're beginning to create a super attractor where they all maintain autonomy, but you're beginning to create a larger whole. So the idea that it now creates a different kind of a mega attractor. This is throwing data anthropology in. Arab studies, bioethics, and computer security course are now interested. So you can see you're creating all sorts of overlaps. You're beginning to create connections between silos, which is what the university is stuck in this siloization. And so over time, what begins to happen is not only does more of the outside world begin to create relationships, inside begins to push out as well. Your budget problem is fixed, doesn't exist in a certain sense, and the silo problem is gone because you have reasons for people to work together. So you map it, and then you begin to use content creation, and then you begin to architect the rest of it. The thing I like so much about this is that the values of a university are manifest in decisions it's made in its legacy. So you could also say this is no longer a value of ours. This is a dynamic attractor. So this isn't all a beautiful world. I'm president here and I'm doing this, and I go, we got to get rid of this one. Look, it's taken over. It's a virus in the system. So you have to begin to think about it. But the beautiful thing is because most of the time the values are the things that sit in the hall on a plaque. And no one really says, yeah, but those values have been instantiated, and let's begin to look at those again through time. So that's the dynamic attractors. That's its 5 core concepts. There was an idea of reaching. Research was done through teaching, shifting from a boiling pot to dynamic attractors. Sparks, which I haven't shown you. The other thing is that once these mega attractors begin to happen, especially when you create new disciplines, you're creating new relationships. Sparks begin to move out into the world. You can make now global connections. You can begin to create even small institutes that have to deal with entities that need to be in the real world that are absolutely related to the academic as well. And that its student pathways are defined by emerging interests with demonstrable assessments, and it is a system that evolves. So that's that one. Sorry, it's long. But those are the two.
Thank you so much. So, I know we're beyond time. Do you want to just take a question or two?
I'll take anything. I do recognize people may be exhausted. Hi, yes.
So what I really loved about the dynamic attraction is that it just blows away everything that's current. And one of the things that I'm interested in studying is the current educational system for the American primary schools, and how we talked about it in your lecture earlier about how it's really outdated. But the way we're taught and the way we're educated, it puts us within a box. We have to bubble in the right answer. There's even rules on how to bubble in that answer. So by the time we get to the university level, that kind of mental confinement would really limit the kind of imagination that would make this kind of thing possible. So I was wondering if during this whole designing universities project that your students had done, did the topic of age, like at what age does a person enter university, or the society is even necessary for a person to be in the university at all? Like, did that ever
No. There's two parts to that. One is that we were actually working with Maine to look at their K through 12 system, and we had an amazing group of partners, and the work was really, really wonderful. But instead of focusing on the mechanisms like tests and stuff, we were actually again asking what does the child need to be, or whatever. And so it was really fascinating. I could go into that, but I'm not going to. So I think yes, we can accept for now that this is the system we're given. But I will also say the Georgetown systems, all of them students, all of them came through that other system.
Right.
And they were just, it was as if their world had opened up to them to even ask them their opinion. And once we were able to get them drawing, And once we were able to actually frame it, not just as let's be radical to be radical or fix what you think is wrong with the universities, but give them the task to design, to first understand what the 21st century is, what now is, and design for that, it became a very responsible problem. And their imaginations just opened up. These are two of the more responsible ones, or the most recognizable. But all of them are absolutely pragmatic. So, yeah, it is an issue. Yeah.
If possible, I don't know if you go back or just make a point on it, but in both diagram models,
How far?
on the y-axis of models for new universities as well as the mechanisms for
Oh, that one.
transformations, you had some outlining elements of like ontologically the state of being, plays a leadership. Yeah.
Got it.
Because in both of these, except the one of community of practice, it seems like there's one that directs exactly to a project. But in terms of leadership, I don't know if that was on purpose, but in both of those, there's not a direct connection. So my question is, between agency and leadership, how can we provide, I don't know if leaders or all of us are imagining better futures, but for the leadership role specifically, as accepting that as different from like a managerial role, how do you really think that for these mechanisms for transformation, where does the leader play in first of all, the university level, but more in this global, connected, virtual?
I think it's super important. These were their projects, and I know what one could do to bump them up into that territory. I do think also, though we have to be very specific about leadership, there's a lot of rhetoric about everybody being leaders. It's not everybody has the propensity or the capability or willing to sacrifice certain things for those other things. So while we all tend to heroize or make heroic the leader, it's not. I just want to be very clear that leadership is not just something you say is leadership. There are very clear traits, there's very clear desire, there's a sacrificing, there's a whole bunch of other stuffs to it. So it is very different than just having the agency and being good at what you do. For instance, only one role of the leader is that they have expertise in one criteria is that they have expertise in their field. There's a lot more to it than that. And I know what I would do to kind of bump them up. Yeah. Yeah.
I appreciated that you brought up Minority Report because I love science fiction. But I think more often go to Afrofuturism, and so there is one, like this whole talk actually really makes me think about, there's this one part in the beginning of Octavia's Brood, which is an anthology made in memory of Octavia Butler. And they switch between using science fiction and visionary fiction, and
I'm just writing this down. I'm not ignoring you because I want.
One way they describe it is by saying that their enslaved ancestors had no reason to imagine that we could exist as free, but they bent reality to make us happen. And I guess thinking about that. And also how that relates so closely to this model or this framework of thinking that you brought to us, I wonder actually how you define radically different, especially because I think like when I think of the word transform, it's the changing of a form, it's a changing of a shape, but there's still this idea that there is a rigid shape, but these images that you're showing seem more flexible. So is the radical difference in like radical indeterminacy, or is it?
So for me, radical is, I use it in the two sense. One is as a extreme condition, but also it's about going to the root. I mean, that's really what radical means, is going back to the root. I love what you're talking about in terms of that fiction, because my own interest in world building is not for the fun of it, but really how do we begin to, this idea of bringing up the difference between transform is really, really important because it does imply that there's already something fixed. or in the most loose sense that you see it as fixed, even if it hasn't occurred yet. That's why we use a lot this notion of shaping the future. How do you shape the context? How do you do things that might create emergent events to happen? And my interest is much more along what you're talking about. How do we envision speculatively futures that we deserve? I'm working with the Alliance for Peace Building as well, which is kind of one of my favorites, but they're the least disorganized. They're the ones that really need to say there's a body of knowledge here, right? How do we begin to first envision the future we deserve? What would be the components of it? And then how do we begin to look very seriously of where we are and then create those systems of action, those actions or components that might move us in that direction? I mean, working with the Jesuits for this new Kenya University, I'm not just taking it as a master plan, nor am I just taking what they think the parameters are we'll just continue more of the same. I mean, the women who can get to school there, half of them, and it's never half and half of them are gone by their second year because they're pregnant, because it's okay for the professors and the other students to get involved with the students. And so there's way more, as I'm working with these people, there's way more than just using it. It's this notion of being able to entertain as viable and then build out the texture around it that way that I think is the most powerful thing about world building.
So someone needs to come in
Yeah, sorry.
at 6 o'clock, but I want to thank you all so much for this.
The questions were great. I do this so I can learn. That's